Thank you. Thank you.
So welcome and thank you all, and I hope you all been having a fabulous day.
Yes.
We've got some brilliant speakers here, and I'm going to start with you, Roly. Thank you for being so hospitable here at the British Library. The other day we saw news that they burned down the library in Gaza. And some years ago when the library, the Canadian National Library burned down, they went into a huge meltdown because they said our 150-year history has disappeared and we don't have anything to sort of show. Here, you in many ways are sort of the center, the repository of the world's knowledge and information. Why is it so important to be that?
Well, Sanjay, you're starting with the deep foundations, I suppose, of the conversation we're about to have, which is, maybe Arthur will tell us, why human beings feel a need to collect at all, and then to preserve and look after heritage and memory of all kinds. And you started in an interesting place too, because I was going to say our topic is museums, and of course we're sitting in a library, and there are distinctions, but of course there are also overlaps as well. Might be interesting to draw out some of those as we explore. But I think all of us, we can take this in different directions, but everyone sees themselves in culture and memory to a degree, and there is a comfort, because we're all mortal, I suppose, to know that somewhere people are selecting or absorbing or preserving and keeping memories, just as we do intimately as families or individuals. So cities do, villages, and then nations do that. And I guess this is just one example of that, and the kind of knowledge we do care for here. As you say, it is international. I wouldn't call it the world's knowledge in its entirety, but it is what it is, and it is a remarkable collection. But actually, and we may come back to this, the sense of fear or loss that you alluded to with a couple of those incidents, and there are very many more, show that actually the world's knowledge is a completely distributed venture, and we all need to care for each other and look after our sister institutions around the world, because no single entity, let alone even one like this, can carry that burden.
One of the things, every conquering general seems to want to destroy records of the civilization before them. If you look at what happened with the Bamiyan Buddha, for example, where they went out and destroyed it, what happened across centuries and across millennia, during the Crusades, or what happened with the Muslim invasions into India. Why do they want to erase what's gone past?
I mean, I'm sure the historians in the room could probably point out that it's a different motive each time. And I mean, Arthur maybe come in with views on that, but I guess it's to do with power, to do with control. In some cases, an invasion may be for reasons of history, but sometimes it may just be the sheer brutality that descends in warfare. You get, and it's such an emotional act of destruction that I guess sometimes it's one of the cruelest and simplest ways to assert power.
Sushma, again, the British Museum is this incredible place that everybody visits because they want to, in many ways, sort of be part of that history or understand the history through objects. You, in the reorganizing of the galleries, for example, and Richard's here, done a brilliant job. So you've gone all the way from today, and there's stardust, and there's a poster of a film poster there, back to 1st century BCE. Why is that? No, 1.5 billion years ago. Why is that important?
As I was saying, I think it's really important that curators don't curate for themselves, and if they do entirely, they've kind of failed at their job. And so when we were thinking about this incredible opportunity, and Richard was obviously key to this as well, we were thinking about, what works for visitors? What do they think about when they even hear the words South Asia? And we found that actually not a lot of people know what that meant. They didn't entirely know which countries comprise South Asia. And there also wasn't a great deal of knowledge about the different regions, the huge, long history, the different regions, the periods, the empires, never mind the material culture. And so I think, given the exceptional collections at the British Museum, we were really uniquely placed to be able to tell that story, from, as we mentioned, 1.5 million years ago with the Paleolithic, and then trace it through different kind of, I suppose, snapshots into particular regions. And I think the wonderful thing is that when you walk through the different sections and you see the beautiful colours of the stones, where it's a mottled pink of Mathura, or the lovely kind of, shiny grey from Gandhara, you kind of have an idea that you're in a particular location. And so it helps to situate you. And so I think it's really nice to do that. And I think another of the innovations there was to actually remove the sculptures from the very centre of that gallery and move them to the side. So now we get to do wonderful programming in the space as well. So you have people and artists being able to respond to what's on display.
I mean, much of the way the museums display this stuff has changed. And earlier it was about shock and awe, so Elgin marbles sort of right there in the middle, or a sarcophagus or whatever. But now it's changed. Now it's really about that one object that's able to take you deeper into that tradition, that culture, that history.
I think it's even more than that. I mean, it's so nice to see Yusuf in the audience because he was one of our co-curators in the Manchester Museum South Asia Gallery. And it was such a special project because at the very beginning, I think you'll agree, we decentered objects. And what we did was we centered people and their stories. And then we thought about, well, how do we populate those stories with objects in a museum so you can share those stories with other people? So actually, I think museums are doing some really interesting, innovative work at the moment. And yes, an object is a gateway into a particular story and can be wonderful. But I think what Manchester has shown that you can actually shift that even more. And so you're facing a person when you're in the gallery and you're hearing that story in a really immediate, interesting way, with the object kind of negotiating, navigating it.
Although yesterday, Punita and I went on this wonderful walk, which was a dramatized walk, telling you the story of the East India Company, and we ended up finally in the Bengal quarters or the Bengal warehouses. And what struck me more than anything else was that not one place had signage that actually alluded to the fact that this was the history of this area. So what makes for collections, for example, the India Museum story that you've been telling? I mean, my wife Punita is a hoarder, and sometimes I sort of forgive her for that because I'm saying, okay, maybe it'll be precious at some point of time, and I should sort of contain my OCD thing about throwing everything away as being garbage. But what makes for collection?
I have to say, I find myself rather out of sympathy with the museum designers who like to focus on the one object that tells the entire story. Coming from a kind of historical background, for me, I have always favoured the very earliest museums were these cabinets of curiosities, which were, by definition, overstuffed with every aspect of the world contained within one cabinet. That was their aim in life, and they didn't necessarily collect in a sort of structured way, the way we would today, but they ended up with a little, what they aimed for was a microcosm. And I think that there's a difference between a collection which forms a microcosm of India or the world or whatever it might be, or indeed through time, and this sort of present day taste for finding the object that tells everything. It may tell it or it may not, but I think you have to do an awful lot of explaining to go along with it. You can't really expect it to tell the story on its own. So I mean, it's striking that you say there's no trace of the
Very little signage
Yeah.
that sort of alludes to.
it was, I think it was within 2 years of the uprising of 1857 that East India House was demolished. It was wiped off the face of the earth. So the process of obliteration, I'm not sure that it was necessarily deliberately undertaken that way, but in practice that's what happened. So while the museum that I was working on survived as a kind of entity, gradually being diminished along the way, but it did move to 2 or 3 different venues along the way after the structure in which it had been contained, the museum itself, if that's what you think of as a museum, had disappeared entirely. So the collection has a sort of life of its own, I think, and it exists by enlightening each object in dialogue with another, as it were.
Sushma, so taking from what Arthur said, so the collection now sits in many different places. Why is it important for collections, or can it be looked in a different way? That does collections need to sit in one place? Today they sit on the World Wide Web, which is where he operates. He sort of is the king of that world. So for you all, in terms of access, how do you see this brick and mortar? Roly and the British Library is doing this huge extension program, 30 million, 300 million, not sure what that number was, but for 2030 and
It's
X
got a
million.
million.
Okay.
Yeah.
Why is it important for brick and mortar to contain what he was saying, a collection?
I think once again, if you talk to people, it's that personal connection with the past. Because I think, when you have an object, whatever, whether it's in a collection or not, it was made by a person for another person for a particular reason. They tend to be really tactile. You tend to get a lot more out of it when you see it in person. You get to walk around it. Otherwise, we wouldn't have some 6 million people queuing up endlessly at the BM to come and see object. Frankly, you could do it on your sofa with your phone, in your pajamas if you really wanted to. But there's clearly a fascination with people of the past. And I think when you talk about incredible collections, as Arthur did, and I do love his book actually, it's a wonderful snapshot into the lives of different people again. All the people who are doing the collecting, the reasons behind that, and what can we learn from that? And, the archives for that are over there, which is incredible. And I think once again, it puts you in touch with people. I think for me, the longer I work in museums, the objects are incredible, but they're only incredible because of the people involved in the amassing of them, the creation of them, the sharing of them. And I think social media and things are absolutely wonderful to share it. And what we found, we just did a whole bunch of focus groups for an exhibition that I'm working on. And it was so interesting because people were saying, it's only if I see something that looks really good on TikTok that I'll come see an actual exhibition. And so, it's not as if we don't share objects and images of exhibitions and things online, but it's a draw for people and for us.
Could I just pick up on that, on the people? Because for us, the theme of people and human beings is absolutely what this story is about. And collection items, books, manuscripts, they're all, as you, I think, have said, they're human products for other humans, and they're there to stimulate ideas, opinions, creativity, and fresh ideas. So for us here, exactly similarly on the digital physical thing, it's both and, not either or. The more we, can gradually fundraise to digitize the collections here, and the longer the queue is every day to get into this building, because, and even the work we do digitally is simply to reach out to even more fellow humans across the world, to enfranchise them to have an experience here.
But why, Roly? Why do they need to queue up here? What's that exchange? Is it because you need to be physically in the space, like the great museums?
Why are people here today? People love being with others, really. There is, of course, for scholarship, you need moments of concentration and quietness just with an object. But even there, and the people, I don't know how many of you use the reading rooms here, it's just easier to concentrate when there are other people also doing the same thing. It's a human encounter, and that's why we called our old strategy living knowledge. It's about knowledge coming to life through those experiences. So I do think it's, we talk about the building an extension here. Actually, it is not to store more books or objects. We're building a great vault in Boston Spa for that. You've just opened up another wonderful. It's to increase the volume of human experiences, the number of people, the number of children, communities, scholars, whatever it may be, because we can see it with footfall. This is a great busy city and people want to come here.
So it's not a sort of alternative to Tinder or date night that they're coming in.
We never prejudge what people come here to do.
Other, reading your book on St Helena's, yesterday in the walk we went to the St Helena's church, which then brought, for me, your book alive, and the history of that, and the fact that 6 of the founders of the East India Company apparently interred their bones, or their ashes are interred there. Tell us a little bit about that book and that story, because I don't think many of us know.
Well, I have full disclosure, I've never been to St Helena, but I was attracted to it, I became attracted to it by virtue of coming across it in the context of the East India Company, because of course St Helena was a way station, particularly on the voyage home from India. Once you're around Cape Horn, the Cape of Good Hope, the trade winds take you straight to St Helena, where the East India men all congregated for, as a matter of security, to make a flotilla to come home together. And so I sort of gradually worked my way into it, sort of 2 or 3 references, and then the paintings which actually hung in the boardroom of the East India Company, showing the various trading stations, factories in India, included also Cape of Good Hope and St Helena, which were essential stopovers on the way home. To my mind, the more I found out about St Helena, the more I discovered it had this fascinating story as a sort of microcosm, again that word, of what was going on in the world from the moment it was discovered by, as far as we know, by the Portuguese in 1510, something like that, and gradually became known to the other trading stations, introducing animals, the goats in particular, for food. And the goats, that was the beginning of the end for St Helena, because the goats gradually ate all the saplings, and the forest cover largely disappeared, soil started eroding and so on. So it's a sort of disaster movie happening in, as I say, in microcosm like this. And today, the population there is doing fantastic work in trying to stop that process and to reconstitute the environment that was there already. So it seemed to me that there were, if not lessons to be learned, it did at least, as I say, form a sort of history in minimis, de minimis, of what was going on in the rest of the world, which deserved to be looked at more closely. People had worked on, botanists have been attracted there, and ornithologists and so on. I simply tried to take an overview of the whole thing and to write, it's subtitled An Island Biography. So it's not not a biography of the population so much as of the island.
Amazing. Sushma, you know, what's interesting is the first ships that sailed out after the East India Company was incorporated. They sailed off to Indonesia looking for pepper, got there, no pepper, the crops had failed. On their way back, they decided to board a Portuguese ship, loot it, and they bring back all of the spices and they're able to pay back all the investors. Now, if any of them were to have then come and said, I'm going to sponsor the British Library, this event, would you take their money?
Well, I'll pass that off to
the
I'll pass
museum.
that to Roly because you mentioned the British
Both,
Library.
both.
So washing my hands of that one.
Both. Go for it.
For both of us, I mean, gosh, it's tricky, isn't it? I mean, for a start, I think that's a question for our new director because it's way above my pay grade. But I think, you know, one has to be careful. And I think if you dig through anyone's family history, you're going to find some interesting skeletons. So I don't think it's institutions alone.
Or government.
Well, that's exactly it, isn't it? Every single person will have something, and so will every institution and every government. So it's surely not a surprise to anyone.
So Roly, what's the color of money, and where do you draw the line? Every day today we're hearing, you know, boycott this and boycott that. We've had this problem as well, and I know we've sat as institutions and organizations around tables trying to find out what is the color of money, and none of us have found that solution. So what's that line? Is there a line?
It's multicolored and multi-hued like everything else. Every other.
Okay, somebody's protesting.
Somebody's
We're really,
but no, like
it's
everything.
the foreign hand.
New sponsors. Yes, like everything else, there is no single colour and there is no single line. And absolutely, you, us, everyone, particularly involved in these vital human activities, which aren't obviously profit-driven, and therefore we all know you've got to keep them going, you've got to keep them nourished and flourishing, but you can't just sustain them in the way that a Google or a Facebook or a Sainsbury's would. So therefore it's going to be a different set of judgments, and yes, even government or state funding has its complexities. There are as many different kinds of states as there are nations. Some want more control, some want less control, and dealing with companies or even individual sponsors. Similarly, you have those debates. So I guess what I'm seeing, like any citizen almost, is lots of really conscientious boards, directors, cultural entrepreneurs, making sometimes really difficult judgments case by case. And I'd never set out to judge anybody, but I would maybe expect them just to be accountable for the decisions that they do decide to make, and that's fine. And
So Sushma, he said it's vital. The arts is vital for humanity. Why is it vital? What happens if none of this exists? What will happen?
Do you know what? I think one of the greatest things about museums, and I guess libraries as well actually, is that you have the shared history of humanity right there. And you can see just the resilience of people, but also how did people across millennia tackle all the challenges that we as people are still facing today? Is it climate change? Is it migration? Is it refugees? Is it war? Is it anything? You will find every single one of those stories in both of our institutions. And so if you want to know how people dealt with things in the past, and I think as human beings, you know, you chat to people because you want to share information, you want to learn something, you want to, you know, figure out something new. You might want to know what you think about something, and you'll do that in discussion potentially. And you can get to do all of that in a museum. You know, if you want to look at the incredible Assyrian reliefs, and you see hunting, but you also see people, you know, being dragged off, you know, after, you know, they've been defeated in warfare, and the horrors that entails. And that was, how many thousand years ago? And it's still compelling now because you see the same thing on your TV. So I can't imagine how museums can't be so compelling for any human being, really. If you pitch it correctly and you welcome people in, I think that's a really important thing for all of us.
Arthur, can we erase culture and tradition just by destroying it, or will it find a way to continue to live on, as, for example, the India Museum that you talk about?
Yeah, well, I think even when the museum, well, when the collections were being formed in the first instance, I don't think there was a deliberate policy on the fact of the East India Company to preserve anything particularly. And it came down to the efforts and to the originality and the commitment of a lot of individuals who were doing work beyond the scope of what they were being asked to do, and who formed the nucleus that the museum, around which the museum was formed. So I think it's always been a matter of individuals rather than corporate effort necessarily. But the question was again.
I mean, can you destroy? I mean,
yes.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, since 1954, I think it is the Hague Convention. You know, we are, none of us are supposed to deliberately target any of the cultural institutions or property or antiquities or whatever in the case of warfare. The problem is today, I think, that many of the and there are many national signatories, of course, to the Hague Convention, but many of the most dangerous forces at work today are not signatories to the Hague Convention, and so in a way they can't be held responsible in the same way that nation states can. Whether you can, I don't think there is any sense that you can destroy, but I'm sure you can diminish. And as you say, the sense of loss that comes with the loss of a library or a museum or a statue of the Buddha or whatever it is absolutely real and cannot be replaced. But one would like to think that life does go on and that it's incumbent on historians and others like us to ensure that it does.
Well, you know, Arthur said, add your piece, but Arthur's talking about corporates or individuals, institutions, government. You have to every day negotiate between government, because a lot of the funding comes from there, but also corporate and individuals. Is there a good, bad, ugly amongst this lot when it comes to control or giving you money? I know that it's
ugly,
difficult,
they're all
but
beautiful,
they're wonderful people. Apart from that, I mean, don't record this bit. They're just wonderful people.
I mean, actually, the British Library is majority publicly funded, actually, and maybe more than even some of the museums that have to rely even more than we do on box office or tickets. Less so. Most national libraries are actually, in that sense, relatively stable in terms of their funding, providing they're supported at all. But I think it's, in a way, our motivation does relate to this fundamental thing we're talking about protection against destruction and preservation for posterity. And just listening to Arthur, I did just want to say that that's making me reflect on a program that we do run here, and I think there's a comparable one at the museum funded by the Arcadia Foundation. Again, privately funded, but with very, very clear and I think superb objectives, which is to recognize, it's called the Endangered Archives Program, and it recognizes that in spite of the Hague Convention and other great interventions which are designed to protect heritage and culture against destruction from warfare, that actually it is highly possible, and indeed does happen, it happens in front of our eyes, that particularly in our area, paper archives can easily get destroyed, and climate change is now only adding to that mix. And every year we dispersed on behalf of the foundation and identified projects around the world where it has been identified that actually culture really is under threat, and that if you and the preservation is done through digitization. And that is where, again, this physical, digital balance, we desperately want both and, but in extremis, if a bomb falls on a great historic library, it is at least better that digitization did take place. And I mean, I know our friends at the Vernadsky Library in Ukraine have been doing that since the beginning of this current conflict, just in the event that the worst happened, that at least the majority of the treasures in some form can exist in digital format.
Sushma, governments, of course, have been behind supporting great institutions like this, as they should. But why do they pretend that they're giving you largesse, where it's actually not their money to give, it's our money, right? So therefore, what's the responsibility of us to ensure that governments do what they should do, which is open all of this up for us who are giving them money to support the arts? And why isn't that argument made? Why are we always so grateful when the manna comes from heaven? Why? As people in the arts, and I'm sorry I'm putting you on the spot here.
It's tricky, isn't it? The thing is, I reckon every single group in the country would probably feel the same way. It's important, we need this. But I suppose it's also, being thankful that at least they do still fund us. That's really very helpful. They've got many other things they could spend their money on. But actually, I think people more and more, they really recognise. I think during COVID, when all of our institutions were closed, I think we all felt the loss. And I think we also, for me anyway, you kind of realise even more strongly that being able just to walk through a museum, an art gallery, a public space with incredible art in it as well, does wonders for your mental health. It does wonders for generating conversation. And I think now more than ever, I think people are aware of this, and they are seeing other museums close down. And I think it's all of a sudden people realise, oh, wait, actually, this does mean something to me. And actually, I do want to help and support this institution or any of the smaller museums around the country to stay, to exist and to continue to thrive. For me, I remember my parents were both refugees to this country, and when I was little, my mum would always take me to Newark Museum in Leicester. I'm from Leicester. Because it was free and it's educational, and for an Indian parent, tick. I would have thought that, without that really early exposure to culture and having it sustained, I would not be sitting here. I wouldn't have come to join the British Museum. It wouldn't even have been, something that I would have considered. So actually, if we want to maintain all of this incredible culture, bringing more and more people into museums, working with members of the community on an equal basis, so that more and more people recognise that this is not just mine, it's ours. And I think that's really important, because I think that does sometimes get forgotten. And I think you do need to have those conversations again and again.
Arthur, the whole conversation about it's ours. Today, there's so much which is not ours in that sense, which has been looted or brought from different countries and now are stationed, whether it's here or the Met or the Hermitage. What is the argument about giving it back or not giving it back? And I know in the UK, this has been a very, very difficult discussion, especially with the Elgin. I'm leaving them out because they're government servants and they can't help it. So I want to put this to Arthur.
Well, a friend recently at the V&A has been much involved in a new book has just appeared on the restitution of Nazi loot. And it sort of struck me that, in a way, that is a problem that is quite specific. It's there is a degree of documentation. You can still trace the families, if not the actual people who owned particular works, to whom they can be returned. And the whole of the restitution so far has been, there's quite a complex and well operated machinery for implementing that kind of restitution. When you start talking about restitution on a national scale, I think it becomes difficult. the material that I was dealing with in the V&A, for example, 98% of it, India, this was the India Museum collection, would not, frankly, thank you for. Because it could be reproduced, or I mean reproduced in the sense that it could be rediscovered many times over in India. But it has value because it is in a context. So the museum collection, to my mind, is much more valuable than the sum of its parts. Whereas were it to be sent back, then it would lose all its value. There are only a few items that are of exceptional monetary or cultural value, I would say, and most of them are from the Mughal courts. And whether Mr. Modi would have any interest in having those back is another matter. And the other point is that the collection came together, it wasn't just seized by sort of British stormtroopers, the way that the Jewish material was, but some of it is in the form of presents, some of it was bought and the prices paid are recorded, some of it were diplomatic gifts, some of them were made specifically for the great exhibition of 1851 and subsequent international exhibitions, which happened at regular intervals throughout the second half of the 19th century. And each of those would have to be negotiated. Well, many of them would not even reach first base in the matter of whether or not any claim could be made upon it. And those that would have to be multiple renegotiations going on, which would, as I think Richard has said elsewhere, would likely take decades to...
Sure. Sushma, is there some moral pressure today on museums to at least check on the provenance of some of the stuff that's coming in? Because more and more it's being discovered that, it's been brought in for all of the illegal reasons, but all of the other issues, whether it's in trade for arms or drugs and so on and so forth. So how do museums now work that out when you're bringing in new stuff? Is there a moral?
I mean, it's not just moral, it's legal. I sat on the museum's acquisition committee for about a year or two, which was really interesting. But, it was fascinating to see just how much provenance you actually need before you can even consider something. I mean, you've got, all the UNESCO laws, I mean, it's from the 70s, and the amount of paperwork and really thorough documentation you need for absolutely everything, as you should, it's probably quite eye-opening for people, actually. Yes, as I said, it is moral, of course it is, but it's also legal that you have to, and as public institutions, anyone has a right to come and have a look at all of this if they want to, do a freedom of information request or whatever it is. So everything is absolutely watertight, and as it should be.
Roly, more and more we're seeing that everything goes on to the back end, the search engines, and Google has all of this information at its control to some extent. Is that too much of power? Can they switch it off? I've
never asked them if they can switch it off. There probably is a very big square. Their headquarters is just right over there.
Are they the new sort of overriding, bad guys in the room?
Well, they're partners and friends as well as an extremely powerful global corporation, and this is that spectrum of relationships that actually underpin all this activities. And I think.
So can they go rogue like the East India Company?
Well, I think we're seeing maybe less. This is a conversation frankly, about search engines, I think we could have begun at least 20, 25 years ago. Really. It became apparent that first great wave of discovery. I can only say when I came here 12 years ago, I was a little surprised at a few, most people said, how amazing, I love that place, what a great institution. But a few did say, oh, why are you doing that? Don't you just need a Google search engine now? Isn't that sufficient? And to the conversation earlier, no, it's not. And you can powerfully see day in, day out in institutions like yours, thousands of museums across this country and around the world, every single physical library. People are needing access to knowledge in 1,000 ways that go beyond just picking up an iPhone and quickly searching. And part of that is the social human experience. Part of it is quality of knowledge and scholarship and awareness and authentication. And I have to say, when you come to really big collections, although huge amounts of work has gone on the last 25 years, of course, to digitize manuscripts, books, other things here. Honestly, if you look at the sheer physical, even pre-copyright collections that we hold here, it's still only a minority of it. So there's vast amounts of knowledge, written material, ideas, stories, memories, which I'm afraid no search engine in the world yet has contact with. And yes, sure enough, I'm sure similarly other large institutions, the next wave now coming through of AI-backed, data-hungry organizations are aware of this. And I think it probably is good judgment for the big cultural memory institutions to take our time over this one, because in a sense we think in decades, centuries, and knowledge can be generated in many, many ways, and it's great to have these digital tools that can accelerate and simplify certain parts of the process, but they are far from being everything that the culture needs to do that job of knowledge building.
Sushma, is AI a threat to culture and the arts, or will it enhance, say, in your case, your collections, which are enormous, and you can't ever actually show everything? Will it help?
I'm sort of glad you asked me, because we recently produced some new postcard packs of different sort of artworks from the early South Asia collections, and I thought, let's get ChatGPT on this. Maybe that can write the captions for me. And they were rubbish, absolutely rubbish. And I even said, maybe write a caption of the goddess Ambika, the Jain goddess Ambika, in the form of William Dalrymple. And even that was rubbish. It was so funny. It was hilarious. And you're sort of getting all this information, and it's just nonsense. It's all so generic, and so much of it is just wrong. And I thought, thankfully, my job is secure, at least for the near future. So that's good. But I think when you spend some time on TikTok, and I've recently started spending more time on TikTok, seeing what's out there, there is so much misinformation, and people are genuinely looking for authenticity, like you mentioned, accurate information based on actual research. And so I can't imagine AI kind of doing away with that, because I suppose AI is only as good as what's on the internet.
A prompt.
Exactly, and you're going to trust some random blogger writing about something they have no knowledge of, because if that's all you're going to rely on, you're not going to do very well with that. So I don't yet feel any form of threat.
I'm going to open it up in a second. Arthur, is considered knowledge and information in a way also power, because it allows us to cut through all of this, the Wikipedia and the Google search kind of stuff, and actually have considered knowledge and information. And does that then empower you to make a considered statement and have a considered viewpoint?
I think it become impossible to be a museum curator without having a sort of electronic dimension to you have the object, and you have the archive of the object, which formerly would have been a card index or whatever. It cannot but go on being a matter of internet access from now on, and greatly enriching the possibilities, because you not only find an image of the object, but you're led to the various references to publications, either in traditional form or in electronic form, and then you can actually get to those publications through the through electronic media. So it's almost, there's no way back. We're already there, and all the better, I think. The India Museum book I did is available as a free download, which it was published on the same day as a hardback book and as a free download by University College London Press. And I thought that was a terrific idea, because it made the book, as it were, accessible in admittedly in electronic form to particularly the societies from which the materials I was trying to discuss had actually originated. And ideally, it would have been good if there had been some capacity for them to sort of contribute back and to add to the V&A database. But, you know, I think because I was sort of here today and gone tomorrow visiting professor, I couldn't commit them to something like that. But I'm sure that the means will arise of all of these communities being able to contribute as well as to absorb from this information.
You know, finally, again, it sadly goes back to, so who's paying for everything? And, you know, the color of money. One of the interesting models that I found in Brazil was that, you know, so what happens in Brazil is, say you're in East London or West London or wherever, every trader then pays 1%, and that 1% tax goes to the workings of that community, arts, museum, theatre, swimming pool, library, gymnasium, and the not-for-profit theatre companies and dance companies, etc., with their offices. And it's worked really well. And in return, they get a subscription to go to the theatre for X number of tickets, or free whatevers to the museums, or openings and previews. And to my mind, and this is something we've been saying to UNESCO and at the UN, saying that, hey, why can't we look at this as a model to free up? Every time there has to be a budget cut, the first thing that gets cut obviously is the arts budget, because nobody realizes how much the arts works in building community, in education, everything that we know, all of the value of the arts that we know, and especially across addressing the many SDG goals that we have. The arts actually cuts across all of them. Sadly, there's nobody buying that argument from me right now, but I'll continue to toss my hair. And the nice thing is it's taken 15 years, but in India now, just pre-election, I was told that they've finally agreed to deem the creative sector as a sector. And of course they said, but it can't be this. I said, whatever, you know, just go for it. And so that's been for us a huge, you know, and we're working very closely with the UK now, because your mapping is fantastic of the sector. And, you know, and with the Oxford group that I sit on because of my long hair. But questions? Yes. Oh, there are many questions. So let's start here. And I'll come to you in a second, Naomi, and let's go there.
Thank you. And this has been a spectacular session. It's been incredibly enriching and interesting. So thank you to all of you. This is a question really for Sushma and for Roly. So for the last 3 years, I've been working to try to help our professional musician and music professor colleague get out of Afghanistan. But I'm also, you know, being very concerned about, you know, the arts, you know, visual arts, literature, archaeology, that heritage in Afghanistan. And of course, we've seen what's been happening in Ukraine and in Gaza. It's a very simple question.
Or Afghanistan.
And Afghanistan.
And Darfur.
And Darfur. And in a lot of places. What are our national institutions doing to support institutions there? And what could we do? What can we do?
So what are national institutions doing to support folks in other countries? We'll just take a cluster of questions and then we'll come back. Yeah.
Hi, thank you for the panel. That was really good. One of the reasons that Sushma alluded to myself not coming from an arts or heritage background and becoming a co-curator for this first permanent gallery to South Asia in Manchester, and one of the reasons I became involved and felt committed was because I felt the culture that I grew up with, whether it's the working class communities in Manchester or ethnically diverse communities in Great Manchester, that there are many untold stories and people haven't necessarily documented them. So how can you inspire people to document them? So I guess my question is, what roles can museums and libraries play to inspire people to take those microcosm stories from people's personal histories, and at what point do you get them to connect back to share that widely? I say that because this week a colleague of mine has just finally donated some Jewish tags that his great-grandfather had from the family to a collection. So people have trauma and are now starting to feel comfortable to start sharing these stories in a wider space. So where do you connect them back?
So where do you connect them back? And one more from Amit, and then I'll come back to this side.
Thank you, Sanjay. I had a question about the big South Asian diaspora in the UK. Can a bit more be done to attract them to institutions like the British Library, the museum, other art institutions? And would it help if the labeling, I know that a lot of relabeling is going on, could be made a bit clearer so that the label says that this object came from India in these circumstances?
So, just to recap, so her question was, what are institutions doing to help institutions in distress in countries? His was, how do you connect people and their stories back? And of course, how do you bring more people from diverse communities into your institutions? And can you really?
Quick go first, and then
I'll go with start with that one if that's all right. I think we're doing a huge amount to attract more South Asians to the cultural sector, actually. And, I'm the first South Asian curator of the South Asian collections at the BM. It took, 260 years? Something like that. Permanent one, anyway. Yeah. But the first one hired on a permanent basis, and that's a really big deal. And as part of that, I also have 2 PhD students, both South Asian women, working with me, one of whom is also my project curator. And I think the more of these kinds of projects that we do, the more people are seeing them as a viable career. And I say viable, I wouldn't necessarily say financially viable, because the pay is still appalling. But at least people are seeing it as, oh my goodness, actually maybe this is a job. And being featured in things like, Eastern Eye and stuff, or Asian Voice, it's actually quite a big deal, because people then can point at it and go, well, that's an actual job that this person is actually doing. Maybe I can go and study ancient history at university, and maybe I can do some volunteer work in a museum to start, developing my skills and knowledge and network. So actually, I think quite a lot is happening, and in the last 10 years, I've seen things change dramatically. So I'm absolutely seeing that change happen right now. And if I can just mention the label bit, that's really interesting. And I think colleagues in different museums are trying different approaches to see what suits the institution, the collection, the display, exhibition, whatever it might be. We've got a panel of community members, because for an exhibition I'm working on, the community element is really important. I learned how important that was with the Manchester project. And in fact, the first week of July, one of the things we're talking about is exactly what you asked about. How are we going to talk about provenance in the labels, in the exhibition, in the panel, in the book? What kind of things can we do? And I think another thing that's worth bearing in mind is when you're looking at very ancient material like I do, I look after the early South Asia collections, they have a really long life beyond that one tiny moment when they entered, a public collection. And I think just by privileging that little piece of information, I think it somehow diminishes the rest of its history, because there have always been empires and looting and all of these things going on, and repurposing of devotional art as well. So I think it's finding a way that it's not remotely diminished, but it's also somehow enhanced. And for my exhibition, there are going to be moments of collecting history alongside the narrative, so that more nuanced story can be shared beyond just the label, because, you know, our colleagues who look at interpretation have found that most people don't read labels in galleries. They do in an exhibition if they've paid a lot of money for it, but not in a gallery. Something like 15 to 20% of people will read labels. So I think we put sometimes a little bit too much emphasis on that one little piece of writing.
But it's also the font size, right?
No.
The font size.
That's the question I normally get asked.
No, exactly. No,
Whatever it is, we'll make it bigger.
It's always accessible. We do it to a certain standard.
Conscious of time, taking other questions, but I'll quickly try and maybe then take the other two very,
Go
very
for it,
comparable. Agree with all of those. On the question of supporting fellow institutions in other countries, I think for the larger institutions like us, it's a duty and a privilege to do that. And actually, if you look at our Knowledge Matters strategy, we're more explicit than ever about really seeing that as part of a role. You can only push it so far. I talked about the Endangered Archives programme, but we don't always shout about it. But yes, we're very alert to when fellow curators or institutions in situations of danger are. We work very closely with other government agencies where we can, particularly where we can provide expertise or even resources. And that would be worthy of another whole conversation in itself, actually. Question about community stories and local, the microcosmic stories, so interesting. You've touched on it already, and obviously you've worked together in that field. I mean, increasingly here, even when we do our big quasi-blockbuster exhibitions, we will try and do an element of community storytelling and curatorship in that. You can see it in Beyond the Baseline at the moment, our big history of Black British music, where it's punctuated by extra pieces which kind of cut across the big narrative, where we've co-created stories from different engaged sectors of the community, and it's a brilliant extra layer. And I hope we now never stop doing that. And who knows where it goes? I think it may end up changing the whole nature of the stories we tell.
Did you want to?
I mean, one of the advantages of having the sound guide as well is that it can be in any language.
That's also true.
And so,
Any length.
any language. So that in a way it's a means of democratizing the exhibition beyond what it says on the label.
And you don't have to go on a guided walk with, wear it and you do your own thing. I loved it in Prado. Another round of questions. So Naomi, Dr. Anu, and Richard wants to ask a question.
Thank you. I mean,
If you keep it all short, then we'll get more.
Yeah, I care so much about your institutions. I have really lived in them, and I've written plays, and in them I've been inspired by them. I care desperately about your institutions. But I just want to tell you that as an artist, approaching your institutions with an idea about what to do is really hard. And I've been through this cycle so many times. Okay, the only way in is through the engagement people. The engagement people their eyes glaze over, like as if they're going to have to talk to a curator about what your idea is, and then they put you in this sort of cycle of waiting to talk to them, and then it never happens. And if you try and get through to the curators, they send you an email, and then they never reply again. They say, that's really interesting. And this walk that Sanjoy's talking about is my walk, and I've got leaflets here. And we did it yesterday. And I tried so hard to engage all the museums in London, Victoria and Albert. I just can't even list the Museum of London, the Museum of Home. I went through this cycle with them, and nobody helped me. I did it all by myself. My artistic manifesto is the transcultural democratisation of spaces, and I'm in your institutions all the time. They are bastions that individuals
question,
can't.
otherwise I'm going to have to. We take that.
Let's
do Naomi and Richard.
Thank you all for this brilliant session, as all are with this wonderful literary festival. I have two questions, if I may. First is for Arthur MacGregor. I'm interested in the photograph collection from the East India Company, if you could indicate where that's located. And one that I think Roly will cross me off his Christmas card list if I was ever to be fortunate enough to get on it. My question for Roly is regarding IT security. I appreciate that it's an ongoing issue, but IT is such a huge issue for all organizations. The NHS crisis with security issues. It's a major problem for so many organizations. And I don't know, I appreciate sort of the sensitivities and it's ongoing here, but I wonder how much you might be able to share with us for people to learn from and appreciate from the organizational perspective the challenges of keeping things secure, please.
So what happened? And Richard, quick question from here.
Thank you, and thank you all very much for your presentations. I just wanted to add one wee element, something that Arthur mentioned about the the transfer of knowledge from collections. From our experience at the museum, the database has on it and gives the viewer the opportunity to send information back to the museum. So there is a two-way exchange. And just further to add that another element of democratization, if you like, of the collections is the way that I've been in remote parts of India, and through purchase in the bazaar of a dongle, I've been able to call up the database, I've been able to show people objects, and they have then contributed their knowledge, which has then come back to the museum. Wow. So the digitization of collections is a spectacular opportunity for all of us.
Thank you. So the question from there that big institutions are bad puppies and nobody responds. Now, in short,
Should we have a quick go? I think
I'll do it very quickly.
Quickly.
Just one on this one, just to highlight the work we're doing with the Sloan Lab, with obviously British Life and everything, because we talk about databases and it's all very exciting, it's very cool, but it tends to work better for academics because you know what you're looking for. What we're trying now is to find, how do people really want to engage with a database? Because often you'll find that they're looking for stories, and that's what they might want to put into a database to get the information out. So I think we need to move, we've got these incredible databases, and I think we're now looking to take it to the next level so that it is easier for people to access. So then I'll pass on to
Roly about the learning from
well,
the
there's a couple of, we probably talk a little bit together about photographs because I don't know about the East India Company, but the Archaeological Survey of India photograph collection is at least a big portion of it is held here as part of the India Office records. In fact, we did that amazing exhibition with CSMBS in Mumbai. Some of it may have begun under the company era. And there's a lovely book. Oh, look,
there you go.
Product placement. There you go. Yeah, the book still exists.
In fact,
Arthur, is that right?
Yes, the East India Company was, right at the forefront of the use of photography for documentary purposes, and almost at least two officers of the company, one Linnaeus Tripe, unforgettable name, and the other one, I forget his name, who attended the great exhibition and were enthused by what they saw there in the way of early photography, taught themselves essentially how to do it, went back to India and applied it to before the survey of India, surveying ancient monuments and sculptures and inscriptions and so on. And so they're right in the forefront, I think, of the development of the use of photography. And from 18 after 1851.
The question was what date?
So from the 1850s onwards.
A very quick answer
let me quickly
on the lesson because
let me
they're going to
quickly
wave us off.
attempt the other two answers. Longer conversations needed. I'll try and not give it over 6 because you've raised a huge question there about creative engagement with artists by major museums and institutions. And I think honestly, deep in the constitutions, these often Victorian institutions, were not set up to do that. It's been a fantastic explosion in the last 15 years, and I think it's not just we're still learning how to do it. That hunted look you get sometimes is because it's just not organisationally set up to make it easy for those things to happen, and yet they're wonderful when they do. So work in progress, and let's use days like this to progress that conversation. On the IT security question, I don't know the exact date, I think it was March 20th or something. Please look at the blog that I published if you are interested in this, on our Knowledge Matters blog, where we published a very candid and open report full of lessons to be learned from our experience, because we took a view when we had an incident like that as a knowledge sharing institution. The best we could do would be at least share knowledge, and it's been horrifying to see what's happening, for instance, with NHS this week, a very comparable incident occurring there, which is not just data theft but sabotage, and it's really tough to do.
Thank you so much. Arthur MacGregor, and his book is available for signing. The St Helena's book, I don't know whether the India book is out there, but St Helena's is there. And for those of you who want to go and see the church, well, you need to sign up for the walk. Sushma Jansari, Roly Keating, ladies and gentlemen, thank you.
Thank you.